The Resident Evil remake from 2002 is one of the best games of all time. If I cared about review scores, this game would be my perfect 10, so that you'd know it's my subjective opinion that it's subjectively perfect. Seriously, this game is so good. It is almost as good as Metal Gear Solid 3. That's how good this game is. It's about as good as Bayonetta. That's how freaking great this game is. And I don't even think it's nostalgia. I didn't play Remake until about 2009 when it was way past its prime, and I was still feeling the magic. This is what happens when 6 years of time, experience, and profits polish a genre-defining archetype into a masterpiece. If RE4 killed Resident Evil, then Remake killed the classical survival horror genre. Horror games are still being made by the boatload, and Silent Hill might have surpassed RE in terms of raw spooks and storytelling, but as far as atmosphere, immersion, and the simple brilliance of good game design go, the Resident Evil remake is the peak of this genre. Nothing since then has met this sheer level of quality, and nothing nowadays really looks, feels, or plays quite like it. It's a quick and concise 7 to 10 hour game that is meticulously paced to the T. You're completely immersed in the developer's design here. This is an experience heavily directed right down to the camera angles. Every single frame the player sees is the director's. Every angle is specifically shot to balance visibility and tension in its own individual way. After all, what you don't see is always going to be scarier than what you do. And since this is a video game, being able to see where you're going and what's coming at you is going to provide a huge tactical advantage. These camera angles hide monsters behind corners, and they also reveal useful lines of sight, only if the player puts their footing into it. The developer has to know both what the player does and does not want to see, in order for this system to work well. And that's really a lost art, now that all the horror games out there have a manually controlled camera. The rigid, stiff, one-shot-at-a-time combat means that the devs could make the player's ammo count rise and fall exactly when they need it to. You usually find about 15 pistol bullets per 3 zombies, and since one zombie takes just over half a magazine to defeat, you're better off evading enemies or even taking the hit rather than actually killing things. But now that horror games are also these domineering shoot-'em-up power trips, that is also a lost art. Even the dispassionate technical quality of life feature that is a game save becomes a game token here. Ink ribbons are placed so that you find about 3 of them for every major key or puzzle item, so that saving the game is both a savory reward and a strategic gameplay decision. But now that every genre has the same autosave and checkpoint system, you get the idea. One more abstract thing that's remained unique about Remake is its 90s simulationist level design, where you backtrack through the same house for the whole game. The whole mansion is a puzzle box, every movable bit mechanically connected to something else somewhere, potentially all the way on the other side. You do a hell of a lot of backtracking, but since you either shouldn't or can't be killing the monsters you're backtracking past, it doesn't get old. And since every room has its own distinct personality and visual theme, I wouldn't be surprised if even casual players after their first playthrough could scribble out a map of this whole game just from memory. Every item is placed deliberately, every camera angle hides just what needs to be hid. The puzzles aren't too hard and they aren't too easy. There's just enough hints and just enough secrecy. And now, after 13 years, it's easy to notice how Remake has certainly remained punishing, but it's also not downright cruel. After coming from The Evil Within and Alien Isolation, I was surprised to see that there's a fairly low density of player deaths here, compared to new games. Compare the Chainsaw Man, the boulder, and the giant fish that can instantly kill you in the first hour of RE4 to just this shark halfway through Remake. It's set to an invisible countdown timer on a certain part of this path, which totally breaks the consistency in the rules of every other monster in the game. Nothing else in this game just instantly kills you without a warning like that. It just made me notice that a balance has to be struck between the damage output of enemies against how much lost progress a player death represents. So in something like RE4, where dying just sets you back a few minutes, enemies are going to have to deal out a whole lot more damage in order to remain threatening. Meanwhile, in RE1, the traps can be reset, high damage attacks can be dodged, and it takes about 3 good zombie bites before you should start worrying. And this shark is the only instant death in the whole game. It goes against the rules, but I don't really mind that. The things that are frustrating about Remake have a point. The things that might look like they're flaws, like the tank controls, the backtracking, the save systems, and the tiny inventory space, they all have a purpose or a payoff to them that the developers were making that sacrifice to accomplish. including this shark. After getting eaten so many times before figuring out how to avoid, then drain, then electrocute this shark, you have to grab an item placed next to the mouth of its corpse. That's freaking brilliant. Taking 5 footsteps to grab that thing and walk away was the most nerve-wracking, terrifying experience I've had in years. REmake was the swan song of a lot of things. It was the swan song of its kind of self-contained backtracky level design. It was the swan song of that kind of scorched earth game design philosophy, where so many sacrifices were made to boost up other elements of the game. It was the swan song of 2D pre-rendered backgrounds. They really did look like they were 15 years ahead of their time, and they were shot from really pretty and interesting angles. And with the extra performance that having 90% of the screen being a JPEG offered, REmake finally marked a point in graphical fidelity where the 3D assets didn't jar horribly against the 2D. This game still looks fantastic to this day, if you play it on the right display. Which is the only real problem I have with REmake. The critical flaw, the one unintended flub that wasn't a part of this game's grand design, is that it's gonna look awful on an HD TV. The glowy phosphorescence of CRT pixels and the tiny scan lines between them make for a kind of anti-aliasing effect that sharpens low-resolution images from a distance, which is why the game still looks so damn good, but only on older TVs. And so, 13 years after launch, we just got a remake. I was really excited about the prospect of seeing these backgrounds properly fitted for 1080p, but they don't quite make the cut. Some backgrounds look fine in HD, others have a very stretched, filtered look to them that isn't going to be fooling anybody. All of them are still formatted for a 4:3 screen ratio, and all of them do look pretty pixelated in 1080p. Which means this isn't a true HD remaster like they're billing it. It still looks good, but when I play the GameCube version now, I am still overwhelmed at just how amazing every single angle looks. And when those images are stretched out to a resolution higher than they were ever intended to be seen at, it doesn't quite have that same effect. I briefly emulated the GameCube version to get a clear look at both iterations of these backgrounds. The 3D assets in REmake were upgraded very well. The game's running at 60 FPS now, which is always nice, but the backgrounds look more like higher resolution backups of the originals rather than truly high resolution re-renders of the originals. REmake also has a new camera-oriented control mode that makes a lot of sense until the camera angle suddenly switches axes and you have to reorient yourself. But it's almost a non-issue since tank controls are always going to be bound to the D-pad. You can switch between the two of them as you need to just by pressing different buttons. Zigzagging in and out of a zombie's grab radius certainly makes the game easier, and that's not how it's intended to play, but it's still REmake, which means it's excellent. The only complaint I have is that it just meets my expectations rather than exceeding them. And it's just $20. Buy it, please. You'll be sending Capcom a message. Over the past 2 weeks, I played Jill's campaign in REmake, and then I did Chris's on the GameCube version, and then I played Jill again on the Director's Cut PlayStation version, pretty much so that I could just hear this line one more time.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
That's hilarious, but this stuff set the bar for the kind of voice acting people expected from horror games in the future. RE1 had a terribly low budget for acting, and 90s Capcom had a terrible localization department, which meant that this game got hilariously bad writing and acting.
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things. Better take it with you.
This is a trend that followed just about every other Japanese horror game up to the mid-2000s, even when other Japanese games were mining the talents of much more believable voices. I guess what people found out is that, kinda like in a David Lynch or Hitchcock movie, bad acting kinda weirdly translates into good acting for horror and thrillers. You know something weird's going on when everyone is acting this strangely. Another fortunate side effect of the times were these surreal, green-screeny backgrounds, which was another creepy quirk of the mid-90s. There's so much detail poured into the lighting and textures here, but little to no attention given to the actual details filling the room. The entire mansion is missing a lot of furniture and decorations. It's really eerie. You know something weird's going on when everyone looks this disconnected from the world they're in. With these backgrounds drawn to a whopping internal resolution of 320 by 240, they're not going to look great no matter what display you use. They were intended to look a generation ahead of time, but they used a resolution a generation behind the times, and the 3D is, well, it's a PlayStation 1 game. Which means the 3D isn't awesome. But since classical survival horror is more of a novelty now than it was 10 years ago, the game still works. It's a hell of a lot more playable than, like, System Shock 1's default controls were. It still holds up, but playing it nowadays probably tells us more about just how goddamn good of a remake is. It's a more ambitious effort than the Zelda and Halo remasters we're getting nowadays, but it still sticks to their same policy of not reinventing the core gameplay. Remake doesn't take anything away from Resident Evil, but unlike modern remasters, it adds a whole lot of new features and content, and the graphical upgrades spared no expense. Unlike the first game, you've got defensive weapons, a couple new maps, zombies that can break out of their rooms, and item placement and puzzles were changed to keep old players on their toes. Lisa Trevor's subplot was added, and it gives a lot of foreshadowing and backstory that really helps pace the whole experience a lot better. It's also smart that her story is completely unrelated to the continuity of the rest of the series, because the Resident Evil continuity is batshit insane anyways. Remake also added a new monster, Crimson Heads, and these things change everything. In this game, dead zombies come back to life upgraded as better zombies. Remember how I said you're not supposed to kill things in this game? That's because of Crimson Heads. These guys are a looming territorial force that completely change the way you chart your routes through the game. Most of the zombies in Remake are in high-traffic hallways and hub areas that you backtrack through, and that's to keep traveling interesting over the long term. In Remake, they added more puzzle pieces that were made to make you backtrack more, like the death masks and the emblem key and the umbrella crests. This is to keep you walking past those same zombies in the same hub areas throughout the whole game, and if you blast through them in the early game, they're gonna turn into Crimson Heads in the later game, unless you burn their bodies or try your luck with a headshot. There's only enough fuel in the entire game to burn about 16 bodies between the 63 zombies, and if you go with the headshots, then you better make a healthcare budget because you're gonna take a few hits in the process. So safely taking a zombie out now is a real drain on limited resources, and letting zombies live is a risky investment in your long-term ammo supply. And those are really interesting decisions to be making in a game full of zombies trying to eat you. What they do is they make Remake a game that squeezes way more tension out of short-term travel than the original. Remake has you backtracking from places 2 or 3 rooms over. On the other hand, RE1 has you backtracking from one end of the mansion all the way to the other. Note how in RE1 there's no save room between the caves and the labs. In RE1, the MO discs are spread further through the game, rather than 2/3 of them being in the same area like in Remake. Remake adds a safe shortcut that connects the mansion's east wing to the central hub, but it encourages you to take a shorter and more dangerous route past zombies that could turn into Crimson Heads, and the way they do that is by making this one little doorknob in the route rickety and broken, and that is freaking brilliant. The new focus on squeezing more tension out of shorter distances is probably best seen when you activate the lab's elevator. A couple simple switches in RE1 turns into this toe-curling trek through 3 rooms where you have to carry fuel that blows up if you press the run button. And you're being chased by monsters. It takes about 5 minutes, you travel about 30 meters, but it feels like being stalked for an hour over a mile, and that is freaking brilliant! Remake is an artifact of great game design. It's also one of the most pure and polished examples of what the survival horror genre was and what it could have been. It was also an attempt to restart Resident Evil as somewhat more respectable than it was before. RE1 had terrible voice acting, terrible production values, and typos in weird places. It also had this intro, this glorious, wonderfully awful intro.
No! Don't go!
Everyone's wearing MC Hammer pants, the music is loud and cartoony, and there are explosions all over the place. It grinds against the tone of the game so hard that it's amazing this stuff was directed by the same team.
Joseph!
Where the hell did they find these guys? We may never truly know, because they were only credited on a first-name basis. The developers didn't care about this game's story, and they just wanted to do a quick and dirty shoot locally in Japan. So I guess they hired the first people who showed up who could speak English. They didn't care who they found. Jill was actually in high school at the time. There are also a couple of gore shots they cut from the Western version of these cutscenes. So, a year after the launch of the original game, they intended to make a director's cut that would feature those uncensored cutscenes with the gory shots still in. But the localization team must have missed a memo or something, because they ended up releasing the game with the censored cutscenes while still managing to print, ship, and sell thousands of CD sleeves, claiming otherwise. Also, the soundtrack in this director's cut is, it's a bit strange. Here's the basement music. It doesn't exactly sell the scene, does it? They replaced the perfectly fine soundtrack that was there before with one by a composer who was actually known to be deaf at the time. Mamoru Samuragochi was his name, and despite his disability, he miraculously managed to have one of the most successful musical careers in Japan's history, all the way up to composing music for the Sochi Winter Olympics in 2014, which is when people found out he wasn't actually deaf that whole time, and that he had a ghostwriter making the music all along. He had everyone fooled for over 15 years. That's hilarious, and it ironically fits the stumbling, contentious story of this game's development. RE1 might have had great level design and atmosphere, but let's face it, the production was absolutely botched. But that's just another thing you don't see these days. A mainstream, genre-defining success that was, in a way, crippled by its shoestring budget. REmake was a chance to change all that, to cut the camp and give it its own style, to have a box that looked less like Evil Dead and more like nothing else, just Resident Evil. It was a remake that remarketed the brand as high-budget spectacle, as quality rather than schlock. Before REmake, this series was remembered for moments like this.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
And after REmake, it's known for moments like this. But for me, the most memorable moments from REmake are moments like this. It's a game about quiet, understated, subtle moments that hit hard because of what they don't show you. It sources more romantic gothic horror tropes for its scares rather than the grindhouse. It managed to make an evil underground lair with freaking mutant zombie sharks feel believable. The Lisa Trevor subplot, as gruesome and gory as it is, hits hard because the game spends hours building it up and then hides it right back away again in the shadows as soon as you figure out what's going on. REmake is the amazing moment in this series where, against all odds, Resident Evil was kind of classy for once. When the cutscenes weren't playing, at least. But anyone who's played this series, and anyone who really follows survival horror games, should know how this story ends. REmake bombed on the GameCube. Its low sales are a frequent reason cited as to why the series switched gears so hard at number 4, with all the focus on the action and the smoother playability. But maybe, just maybe the reason it didn't sell as well the first time is not because consumers were tired of tank controls and pre-rendered backgrounds, although I remember a whole lot of internet arguments that made it seem like people definitely were tired of that stuff to an extent, but maybe those initial sales were more to blame because it was released early on in the life cycle of a third-place console whose primary demographic wasn't Resident Evil's. But now, REmake is setting sales records, while a huge explosion in indie horror games is happening at the same time. Alien Isolation garnered a heap of praise, and Capcom is reevaluating exactly what they should be doing with this franchise. I think conditions are prime for a comeback. It's high time we got a real AAA survival horror game again, and there seems to be more of a market for it now than there was in 2002. It feels really weird being optimistic about video games for once.